I intended to introduce the talk by saying why the national question is important, but thank you, Drew. You pretty much said the most important part. I think the only thing I must add is that the national question is fundamental because it is, no matter what, a question that we have to deal with, we communists, in our everyday work, whether we are working, from the perspective of an oppressed nation and the perspective of the oppressing nation. This national question always comes to us and comes into play when we in our work. Yet it is so fundamental, but yet it is one of the least understood questions in Canada, and this is why precisely we need to talk about the national question. So it's been about 8 minutes that I'm talking, and I talk about oppressed nation, I'm talking about nation, etc., and the importance of it. But you might wonder, actually, what is a nation? And this is how we're going to start. So basically, of course, the concept of nation has evolved throughout the times. Nation in English comes from French nation, which itself comes from Latin natio. And the first kind of use that is some sort of related to what we are talking about today, what we are referring to today when we're talking about a nation, was in the Middle Ages, where a nation was used to refer to a group of students coming from one same region in a university. So for example, in the Sorbonne University in Paris, you would have the Burgundy nation, you would have the Alsatian nation, you would have the Provençal nation, etc., etc. So this is just to show how the term has changed, the definition of it has changed. And it's only around the 19th century or so that the term was started to be used to something that's quite close to what we're saying today. That is a territory and a group of people in it, and the sort of also the nation being a political entity, in short. And of course, even today, the term of nation is used by many ways. So let's be clear here and make it and say exactly what is it that we mean when we communists talk about nation, national question, and so on. So a nation basically is, of course, it's a group of people that is sharing 5 criteria. One of them is the territory. So there needs to be a common territory for these people on which they are organized. They also share an economy or an economic life, or use the term you want, but basically an economy that, together they are, all the members of the nation eventually participate. They share also a history and a common culture, and also a national sentiment. So these are the 5 criteria for a group of people to be considered, for us as Marxists, as a nation. And very important fact, it needs to be comprised of all of these 5 criteria. If any one is missing, we cannot talk of a nation. We can talk then about a national minority. So you'll see in the program, for example, in some places it talks about the Quebec nation and the Francophone minorities outside Quebec and so on. This is the difference. It's that in the case of minorities and national minorities, there is one element that is missing, one or more. Can be 2, can be 3, that doesn't matter, but then they are not a nation, but a national minority. And of course, that doesn't mean that national minorities have no rights, far from that, but it's just that the rights are different. The fact that these 5 criteria are necessary for a group to be seen as a nation is important because it shows that there are objective and subjective criteria, namely the territory, the economy. For example, these are very objective criteria, whereas the question of the culture and the national sentiment, this is a very subjective. These are very subjective criteria. And so what that means? That means that we can't just be sitting here, you know, in Montreal or in Toronto and start to just analyze the national question in a very detached way from how the people feel. We can't just have a look at, you know, the national question and decide, okay, well, you know, maybe the people, I don't know, of whatever, Newfoundland, for example. And there are some groups that claimed that, I don't know if there are still, but some groups did claim that Newfoundland was a distinct nation. You know, but that was mainly just okay, well, they have a territory, they have some sort of an economy. So, you know, just looking from far aside saying, oh, well, the criteria are kind of matched. Well, you know, you can't decide from outside if a group of people have a national sentiment. It needs to be both. And on the other side, on the other hand, I think it's important also, like, the subjective criteria alone are not enough for a nation to exist. You know, I don't know this too. I know this is something that was told to me. I don't know if it's true or not, but by a comrade from Catalonia, who was telling me that there are people in Catalonia, in Barcelona actually, who believe that Barcelona is its own nation, distinct from the rest of Catalonia. Well, you know, on which basis? There needs to be also some objective basis. So this is, I think, important when analyzing, you know, the national question, and be clear that it can't be just a question of, well, there's a relationship between how people feel and how they see the nation or the group they are belonging to, and you know, the scientific objective analysis, if I may say. Another very important point about the national question is that it is contemporary to the rising capitalism. So that means that it is a historic category. It means that it appears and it disappears eventually. It appears while capitalism is getting, is on the rise, and eventually, once there is no more capitalism, well, nations will eventually disappear. The same way that the feudal tenure appeared in the rising times of the feudalism, and with capitalism eventually broke away. So that's important. It shows that it's a dynamic question, but it also shows that the national question is tied somehow to the capitalist the accumulation of capital. So it shows that it's a very, very violent process. You know, let's take a country, for example, France, which is often seen as the quintessence of you know, the nation state and the fully formed nation. Well, we can ask ourselves, what was the French nation based on? You know, before the 17th, 18th century, France was just a patchwork of different feudal regions and territories, etc. And what gave the possibility of one of those populations to dominate all of them, because this is what we are talking about, it's all about domination. Well, it's the primitive accumulation of capital of the region that's now called the Île-de-France, so the region from where the, you know, Louis XIV and company were from, the region around Paris. And how did that happen? Well, you know, it was not so beautiful. You know, we're close to the July 14th, and well, you know, everybody's going to remember the French Revolution and how that was the ideals of liberté, égalité, fraternité. But the fact is that this is based on what? Well, it's based on the triangular commerce and the slave trade and the exploitation of you know, of colonies, etc. This is what French accumulation of capital is based on, and this is what the national that's what allowed this this part of the Kingdom of France to really dominate all the other parts. And we could look at many countries, but the point that I'm trying to make is that there's no such thing as a pure nation, or a nation that only has glorious, that has just a glorious story. It is all based on dominations, on wars, and mainly on the violent process of the accumulation of capital. Now, if we look more at what's happening here in Canada, I think based on the definitions, and I'm sure you've probably heard that, and it's also clearer in the program, but just to give an overview, well, of course, there are many nations in Canada that fit the definition of what a nation is. So what are the main nations here? well, there's Quebec and English-speaking Canada, which are the two bigger ones. But there's also Acadia, the Acadian nation. I won't go too much in the history of each of them, but well, it's also briefly mentioned in the program. But it's basically those descendants of that came from the Maritimes and eventually were deported in 1755, and some of them could eventually come back. And they settled in the Maritimes, basically, and they're a nation as well. And of course, there's those that we talk the most right now, and that are smaller nations. But there's the Métis nation, there's the Inuit nation, and all sorts of other indigenous nations. And what's important, more so than what are the nations, what's important to understand is that in Canada, as much as in any capitalist country that has many nations, that is, as we say, multinational, there can only, and even more so in the case of Canada, where it's not just a capitalist country, it's an imperialist country. Well, all nations are oppressed but one. And what is this nation that is not oppressed? Well, it's the English-speaking nation. This is a nation that is oppressing the all of the others. How did that happen? Well, basically, because this is not so usual in the capitalist world. Usually, like in France, the national question was dealt with by the bourgeoisie fully, to the point that it's now clear France is one nation, and to the point that they dominated all other nations. But what happened in Canada is that when the when the English-speaking, the British conquest happened in 1760, after the defeat of the Plains d'Abraham in Quebec, what happened is that, the balance of forces and also the problems that the British were having with their North American colonies forced them to set up treaties between the nations they were dominating, some that they couldn't honor, some that they honored. So they honored one with the Catholic Church, for example, in what was left from the New France. And this is what led to the fact that they were not able to fully dominate all the nations there. And this is what led to the creation of many nations. But of course, bear in mind, it doesn't mean, it's not that they didn't dominate them, it's just that they couldn't assimilate them. Probably this is a better word. They were not totally assimilated. So that led to the creation of different nations, rising again with the rising capitalism in Canada. Now you might ask yourself, what is it really that we see? What we think about when we say when we talk about oppressed nations? Well, an oppressed nation, in a nutshell, is a nation for which the right to self-determination, up to and including the right to separate, is not guaranteed. So if you look at Canada, it's quite clear that all those nations are oppressed. If we look at something very recent, what is it? A country that has a sovereign territory, and not just a sovereign territory because they're claiming it, but also de jure, on, that is recognized by treaties like the Wet'suwet'en. What is it other than an oppressed nation, a nation that doesn't have the right to self-determination, when blatantly violating their sovereignty, the Canadian government sends the RCMP, a military police, to force through a pipeline that they don't agree should pass there. This is a clear example of an oppressed nation. And I'm sure there's many other examples, but this is one quite clear and quite timely. Another one would be, what is it, for example, that Quebec, that never signed Canadian Constitution, yet if people in Quebec want to become independent, to separate, so to exercise their right to separate and to self-determination, they cannot do it unilaterally because of the Clarity Act, which says what? Says basically that to be for Quebec to be able to become independent, they need to make sure that first the Canadian government agrees on the question that will be asked, to make sure that the question is clear. This is part of where the Clarity Act comes from. That the Clarity Act also means that the threshold cannot be 50% plus one. It's not clear enough if it's 50% plus one. So the Canadian government has to agree on what the threshold would be. And even if these two conditions are fulfilled, even then, at the end of the day, the Canadian government has to agree or disagree with the outcome of the result. This is a frontal attack against sovereignty, against the right to self-determination. So hence, it is an oppressed nation. In fact, that would just give the right to Canada to do exactly the same thing that the Spanish crown did against the Catalans in 2017. And we saw how violent that was. And we saw also, by the way, how this sparked huge rallies that went far and beyond the core pro-independence Catalonians. So the right to self-determination is basically the right to separate. And unless this right is guaranteed, we're talking of an oppressed nation. This is, basically Lenin refers to this while talking about a marriage. He refers to it comparing the right to self-determination to the right of marriage. No one here around the table would argue that in a marriage, if one of the two partners does not have the right of divorce, it is a forced marriage. Well, this is what Canada is. It was a forced marriage between different nations, often very violently forced into that marriage at the point of a gun. And this is the result. This is the country we are living in. But of course, guaranteeing the right to self-determination as much as guaranteeing the right to divorce within a marriage does not mean that when you get together, you want everybody to separate. And this is not our perspective for us as communists. We don't think that the solution to the national question in Canada is separation of all nations. Why? Not because we are too much attached to the question of the territorial integrity of Canada. Of course we are, but provided that the threat comes from an outside enemy, from an invasion. Of course, in that case, it's different, but that's not what we are talking about here. We're talking about nations that are oppressed and that are requesting their right to exercise their self-determination. And in that case, this is fundamental. We have to guarantee them this right. But the reason why we don't want independence, it's because fundamentally, and this is universal, in the case of independence, of a nation to become independent, in all sorts of national liberation struggles, that requires an alliance of the national bourgeoisie or petit bourgeoisie with the proletariat of that nation. That would mean that this alliance precedes the internationalism of the working class. It precedes the unity of the working class beyond the national question. And that is why we believe that in Canada, this is not the appropriate solution, at least not the one that is to the best interests of the working class in this country. We do recognize that there are in Canada aspects of national liberation struggles, don't get me wrong here, that need to be solved. But we don't think that these aspects precede the necessity to build socialism. In fact, we believe that it is socialism that will, at the end of the day, solve what's left of colonialism, what's left of national oppression, what needs to be finished in the bourgeois national democratic revolution. Perhaps in other countries, things would be different. For example, in Palestine or in Western Sahara, things are different. There, when bombs are basically falling on your head, it's qualitatively different. And of course, in that case, the question of independence, of creating your own state precedes the class struggle. But that's not the case in Canada. So, of course, we can talk for a long time about this in a very theoretical way, but let's talk a little bit about what our solution is. What our solution is to bring national equality in Canada, because this is what we are talking about. This is what we want. We need to achieve national equality in Canada, or maybe better said, not necessarily to achieve it, but to mobilize in favor of this, for the working class of the nations to feel that they are part of the same struggle of that of the oppressing nation. And so our solution is basically to totally scrap the actual Constitution of Canada, that of 1867/1982, which is the product of this forced marriage that we have, and that, anyways, not even every nation in Canada has signed. Not even every province in Canada has signed it, as I said. So what's that solution? Well, it's a equal and voluntary partnership through a new constitution that would guarantee, well, would first recognize the different nations. Right now, the Canadian Constitution does not recognize any of the nations, and that would also guarantee them the right to self-determination. It is only provided that this right is guaranteed that we can convince the different nations that they are actually part of an equal and voluntary partnership. Why? Because independence is, at the end of the day, the main leverage that a nation can use in case they are not agreeing on the terms. They can say, okay, you don't listen to us, well, then we're going to separate. And you can't do anything because it's part of the Constitution. Well, that kind of forces everybody to sit at the table and try to find solutions. There are many more precise points about the equal and voluntary partnership in our program, namely that, replacing the Senate by a Chamber of Nationalities, which would basically have, each nation would have the same number of people, elected people. So basically they would have all the same weight, and that would counterbalance the proportional representation of the House of Commons. This is a very interesting proposal that we are, I think, the only ones to put forward. But the point is that this solution is the only one that goes as far as giving the right to self-determination up to and including separation. I think that no other, not even any social group on the left will go as far as that. And this is something that we as communists have to be proud of. This is really the only solution that allies both the working class's internationalism, that is the conception that the working class across all nations has more in common, including the working class of the most oppressed nations in Canada, has more in common with the working class in the oppressing nation than with their own bourgeoisie. This is our perspective. This is what we think is the most revolutionary perspective for this. Of course, that doesn't mean that strategically and tactically, especially in the fight for a people's coalition, we won't win people from the petit bourgeoisie, national petit bourgeoisie with us. We need to do it, of course. But the point is that our perspective is not based on their vision, but it's based on our vision, that of the proletariat, so that of the class, rather than that of the nation. And fundamentally, what the task of communists is, in order to efficiently fight for our solution, to implement eventually our solution, is to understand that there are two strategies regarding the national question, and that is that in the oppressing nation, the number one task of communists, of socialists, is to fight against big nation chauvinism in all its form. But in the oppressed nations, as hard as the fight against big nation chauvinism is important, we need to fight against the narrow nationalism of the oppressed nation.